Hey, welcome to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute with your host, the alchemist of Indiana's Black Forest, Alan Bishop. Hey, this channel is all about home distilling and legal distilling. If you've got questions, reach out to us in the comments below, social media, or via bishopshomegrown@gmail.com. And don't forget to check out thealchemistcabinet.com. Hey guys, welcome back to the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. Just wanted to check in and finally do a couple videos. I do apologize for my lack of presence on the channel the past few days and interaction on the channel and or lack of videos, but I went through the first of my 2 cataract surgeries, which is why I'm currently not wearing my glasses, because reading is a little bit of a pain in the ass right now, because this eye, which has been worked on, my old prescription for my glasses is not right. So I have 2 different sort of focal points happening, which makes reading a small screen like on a cell phone or even a screen on a computer a little bit of a pain in the ass. I tend to do a little bit better close up without the glasses right now as opposed to with the glasses. So if I look a little funny, that's why I'm not wearing the glasses. Haven't bothered to trim the beard or do any of that bullshit lately either, because honestly, Monday was a surgery. Tuesday I couldn't read shit. Wednesday I could read a little better. And today I just don't care. So that's where we're at. But excuse me, I did want to remind you guys to be sure to go check out thealchemistcabinet.com. We do have the new book, The Alchemist Cabinet Volume 2, which is the Black Forest method, which has a ton of botanical recipes in it, a ton of methodology stuff in it. It's not a real long volume, I think close to 60 pages, something like that, with a lot of also photos of old historic distilling sites, etc. From southern Indiana. It's something I'm very proud of. I'm going to try to do a volume of that book once every year, 2 years. As I learn stuff, I add stuff to to my repertoire. I sort of develop more of my own methods and methodologies derived from the original Black Forest method from here in the local area, and try to continue to publish those for you guys, because I think you'll enjoy them. I think they're things that you can learn from, especially if you're the kind of person that wants to sit down and highlight something in the book, etc. There is an Amazon link for that as well that you can find on most of my social media pages. If not, you can message me and I'll get it to you. But if you order from thealchemistcabinet.com, I will sign it for you, autograph it for you, whatever. I know that sounds pretty egotistical. I'm not an egotistical person, but I found that people do like to have the book signed for whatever reason, for memento's sake, whatever. But that being said, also be on the lookout. I just did another podcast with Jesse from Still It, talking about absinthe and tasting through, for qualitative reasons, some of the samples of his stuff, which was a whole lot of fun. I have another tasting of his stuff coming up for qualitative reasons with Justin Whaley in the next couple weeks on one of our segments, 3 and 30, which ends up being more like 6 and 60, or, you know, drink until you drop, one way, shape, form, the other. But that being said, we're going to try to jump into some viewer questions. I do have a little bit of sinus drainage. I apologize. I'm just a fucking shit show today, between the eye and a little bit of sinus drainage from the weather change. Anyways, and you're probably going to notice me like squinting trying to read this shit right now. Again, I'm sorry. It just is what it is. The only way I can get a video done is if I struggle through it right now. So this is from, let's see, TJE. Hello, Alan, and the rest of the family and everyone watching at the One Piece at a Time Distilling Institute. Got a question for you that I feel might be timely for many of us on this new time of corporate super greed, otherwise known as runaway inflation. Might be a bit of a noob question, but it's something I'd never had to worry about before my newfound poverty. I feel that. Can I recycle/reuse my yeast? The stuff ain't cheap. I do mostly sugar or fruit washes, as my wife is celiac, but also a little all-grain whiskey for myself and some rum too. If it is possible to do, could you go over the techniques, pitfalls, etc.? Thanks so much, TJ in Winnipeg. Absolutely, man. I think I've talked about yeast in the past, as far as recollecting yeast or collecting wild yeast, etc. There's a couple different methods to this, and you can be as scientific as you want to be, or as much of a practical distiller as you want to be about reusing your yeast. So I tend to lean into the practical distilling methodology of the old timers. I do propagate my own yeast. We have a yeast strain at Spirits of French Lick that we have been propagating now for, I think we started propagating it about 4 years ago. It's what we call our house yeast strain. And to be honest, and to be fair with you, it literally started off as Fleischmann's bread yeast. So we tend to pitch 2 different yeast strains for each fermenter. We cook a half a fermenter each day, which is 600 gallons. Full fermenter is 1,200 gallons. Day 1, we use our house yeast. Day 2, we'll use 1 of 3 different brand yeast, depending on what we're going for. Either earthier flavors or fruitier flavors, right? Round and dark, or bright and more citrus-like, right? We literally just repitch that yeast every day. So what happens is my still hand will make a cook. He'll make a mash. When it gets down to pitching temperature, he will pitch a Donna jug of about 3 gallons of liquid from the previous mash from the first day after the house yeast was introduced into it, back into that cooker at 90 degrees. And then pump that over into the fermenter, where it'll set for about 12 to 24 hours before we pitch our second yeast. I mention this because there's a secondary question somewhat related to the question you're asking that I'm going to get to in the second half of this video. We then take that yeast, let it get going for another day and a half, 2 days basically, and then use it to repitch for the first day of the second cook. In between, if we are not using that yeast, we put it into, you know, those little miniature stainless steel, you know, I've got some that are like 1 gallon, some that are 3 gallon beer kegs with a little pressurized tab on top. We use those for Donna jugs, and we put the yeast back into that. We'll put it in the refrigerator. Once that oxygen is cut off, and once it's good and cold, it no longer continues to ferment. So it will set there for a period of, we've had it set for up to 6 months before and be perfectly fine. The trick is to let that yeast get up and going for about 24 hours first and work through about 1/3 of the sugar in the fermentation. So it's good, strong yeast fermentation going in there before you cut off oxygen and put it in the refrigerator. We do this with a number of the yeast that we've actually captured locally from a lot of the old distilleries in southern Indiana, including a yeast that I captured, from Spring Mill State Park, the Daisy Spring Mill distillery that we're currently rebuilding from an old 120-gallon hogshead fermenter, as well as a yeast from the McCoy distillery that we actually captured from the wood in the distillery, and a wild yeast that probably started off as a propagated yeast at Cave River Valley for the old Clifty distillery. Those set in storage, you know, sometimes 3, 4, 5 months at a time, and they do just fine for us. The trick is to make sure that you're, you know, handling everything the way that you would as far as making a new mash, with the proper pH, proper sterilization, sterilize your containers, etc. And I have found that you can kick 600 gallons pretty easily with 3 gallons of that previous mash, that previous slurry, after a 24-hour fermentation period. The other way that we do this sometimes is I will actually take either, we'll just stick to this. Sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually take a sample off the bottom of the fermenters, which includes the grain plus the yeast chub, etc. I take that and then I will lay it out on a piece of wax paper and put it into the dehydrator at, say, 95 degrees for a couple days. Dry everything down to a very, very low moisture to where everything is very much stable and ready to store. I then take it and hit it real quick with a coffee grinder to break up all the grain and make it more of a powder, and then freeze that. That yeast is pretty much, you know, viable indefinitely. It takes a little while for it to get up and going compared to the liquid yeast, but I can pull that stuff out of the freezer and pitch it the same way that I would a dried commercial yeast, and feed it a little superfood or whatever you need to, startup, etc., to get it going and have a good viable fermentation and yeast culture going off of that pretty easily. So people will worry about mutation. We've talked about this on the channel before with yeast. I'm not a scientist. I do cell counts underneath the microscope to make sure I do have a healthy, viable yeast. Everything else is done by sensory analysis. And what I can tell you is that in my experience, I've not seen any major mutations that are affecting the quality of the spirit that we're making, or changing the quality of the spirit that we're making in any real noticeable way, so to speak. My theory is that yeast, while it does mutate over time and can mutate over time, the mutations tend to be so small as long as the environmental conditions are the exact same from batch to batch. Say your pH is the same, your specific gravity is pretty similar, the environment as a whole, your temperature, etc., is pretty much the same. That yeast has no real reason to try to mutate, to try to switch up anything in its genetics to become adaptable to a new substrate. Where you do run into problems is if you try to go from, say, a bourbon mash over to a brandy, right? You can do it, but you really need to take a couple days and get that yeast used to that brandy environment, that wine environment, in its own separate small bucket or fermenter, and let it get up and going and acclimated basically to that environment before you pitch it into a larger batch. So yes, overall you can reuse your yeast over and over again. you know, you're going to run into guys out there that are going to tell you you can't do it. And again, you know, some people get very, very scientific about it. Pat Heist is an absolute super genius when it comes from Firm Solutions, when it comes to yeast, right? And he knows way more about than I ever will. All I can say is that from practical experience, those old methods, which both those I just mentioned to you are old school methods, the Donna jug, you know, that was the distiller's best friend for years. The distiller had two of them, 2 copper jugs, usually about 3 gallons of capacity. You had one that you carried to and from work with you every day, just like a lunchbox that you kept an active culture in, that you pitched into your fermenters every single day and pulled back out of. Went back into the Donna jug, that thing went home with you. It went into the spring house. It stayed cool till the next morning. You took it back to work the next morning. You had another one, you closed the drain cock on, put a chain on it, put it down in a well or in a lake somewhere where it stayed good and cold and refrigerated. That yeast would be there if the distillery ever burned down or you lost your yeast for some reason. Those methods have worked well for me for years and years and years on a home scale and a large legal scale distillery. So the reason I mentioned the 2 halves of fermentation, because there was another question and I cannot find the email anywhere now. I'm sure that I printed it off and lost it somewhere, but nonetheless, someone had written in and asked about using, you know, co-pitching yeast. So whether or not co-pitching that yeast, if both yeasts that you co-pitch together are both contributing to the flavor profile, or if they fight each other and one of the 2 yeasts will become dominant. So I do this every single day at Spirits of French Lick. We divide, again, our fermenters, which are 1,200 gallons, into 2 cooks. One day 1, which is 600 gallons. One day 2, which is 600 gallons. Day 1, we use that propagated house yeast that's our own. Day 2, we'll use 1 of 3 different brandy yeasts. What's happening there is that house yeast that used to be the Fleischmann's bread yeast, it is kicking in. It's getting a chance to start working, and it's bringing forward some of those grain forward profiles, those more bread type profiles. Day 2, when we add those brandy yeasts are all what are called killer yeast strains. And by killer, I mean they will outcompete everything, even if there's a yeast culture already going. So, for example, OK yeast, OKAY, or Vin 13 yeast, you throw that in there on day 2 in the second half of that cook in that 1,200 gallons. By the time it catches a foothold against that bread yeast, within, you know, a couple hours of catching a little bit of a foothold, it will wipe out that bread yeast and take over the fermentation. So I don't pitch them together. I give the bread yeast about 24 hours to work, let it get to where I want it at, and then I pitch my second yeast, let it take over and get the characteristics I want from it. So in other words, the alcohol that's already been converted by the first yeast has those particular profiles and those particular qualities to it, and the alcohol that is converted by the second yeast has those particular profiles and those particular qualities to it. There, within that, those alcohols that are created, you get those various different ester connections, etc. You get the various different azerotypes, that's the word I was looking for, in distillation. You're able to pull off the 2 distinct profiles that you want as one unique profile from 2 different yeast strains. But I would not be in the habit of pitching 2 yeast strains at the same time, unless I was doing something like, I've been playing around with some agave spirits. There are 2 unique yeast strains that I've been using for that. I've been sworn to secrecy on one of those 2 strains by my good friend who taught me how to do this. But my suspicion is that the 1 yeast strain, which has some amino acids alongside of it to kind of boost it, almost like a turbo, but without the nasty off flavors, right? Because there's no food grade urea in it. I suspect the yeast that is there is the same yeast as the other yeast I'm pitching with it. So you're really just bumping up that same yeast at the same time. So there may be reasons for actually, I've got hiccups, guys, I apologize. There may be reasons for blending yeast otherwise, but for me, from my perspective, that's not been something I've ever been keen to do or had to do. So, all right, I think that wraps up this set of questions. I'm going to try to get this video edited, get it out there. I'm going to try to do a couple a night because I have eye surgery again next Monday. So I know there's going to be a 2 or 3 day period where I will not feel like doing this for sure. But thanks for hanging in there with me, guys. Thanks for supporting me. Thanks for subscribing to the channel and for sharing it, and continue to share it, please. Please continue to send your questions. I can't keep doing videos if I don't have questions to answer, guys. Even if it takes me a little while to get to them, I will do my best to always get to them and help you out in any way that I can. Go to thealchemistcabinet.com, buy the new book, The Alchemist Cabinet Volume 2, The Black Forest Method. And be sure, if you're into the paranormal, to check out the If You Have Ghosts, You Have Everything podcast. We just wrapped up season 2, and we'll be taking a little extended break here to work on season 3, which is going to go super in-depth into some subjects that I'm really into. And we'll catch you in the next video. Love you guys. Later.